Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to do 4.7a today. Whoop, come on, focus. And the title of this one is Completing the Square. So we're going to do completing the square today. Our objective, because we always start with our objective, is going to be that we are going to learn a new factoring method and then we will use that new method The method is called completing the square. We abbreviate that as CTS. So for completing the square, we're going to use the new method to solve quadratics, because we've been doing lots of work with quadratics in this chapter. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is go back and remember some of our factoring, okay? And what I want you to remember specifically is the perfect square trinomial. So if you'll remember, so I'm going to write one down just so we can talk about it. If I have x squared minus 8x plus 16, this is a perfect square trinomial. The first term, the x squared, is a perfect squared. The last term, the 16, is a perfect square. If I take the square root of x squared, I get x. And if I take the square root of the 16, I get 4. And if I double that, I get the 8. So if you will remember, that is how I have a perfect square trinomial. I would factor this by doing x minus 4 quantity squared. So the purpose of our new factoring method is that we are going to force this situation by adding things to our equation so that I can factor. And we're going to factor our perfect square trinomial. This is actually a really useful factoring method. We will take some quadratics and put them in vertex form using this. We will use it to solve. So it's actually quite handy. All right, so what I'm going to do first is I am going to actually do a problem. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to write down the rules and the steps. I highly recommend that you write these down. And then on the right-hand side, I'm going to do an example. So I'm going to do an example as I write down the steps. So the first step is that I want to put all x terms on the left-hand side of the equation, and I want all other numbers on the right-hand side. All right, so we are going to start with, I'm going to write the original x squared minus 12x plus 4 is equal to 0 here. And now I'm going to do it a step at a time. So the first one says put all x terms on the left-hand side. So I'm going to leave these two terms, and I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides and put my 4 on the other side. The second step, if I cannot touch my computer so I don't kill it, the second step is I'm going to take half of the middle term. Okay, so my middle term is, I'm looking only at the coefficient, so I'm going to write the coefficient because I really don't need to manage the variable. I'm just going to look at the coefficient. So if I take a negative 12 and I divide it by 2 or multiply by a half, it's the same thing, I get a negative 6. The next step is to square step number 2. Okay, so I'm going to take my negative 6 and I'm going to square it, and I'm going to get a positive 36. Step number 4 is to add step number 3 to both sides of the equation. To both sides of the equation. So now I'm going to have x squared minus 12x plus 36 is equal to a negative 4 plus 36. Okay? I can't change the value of the equation, but I can manipulate it. And so what I always want to make sure is that those two terms always add to be 0. So since they are on both sides of the equation and they have the same sign, the net effect is 0. So then our 5th step is going to be to factor the trinomial. And if you'll notice, this is the situation we were trying to create. X squared is a perfect square, so there's the x. 36 is a perfect square. 6 times x is 6x times 2 is the 12x. So now this is factored, and then I combine like terms on the right-hand side, and I get 32. So I factored the perfect trinomial on the left, and I combined, I'm going to simplify the right-hand side. And luckily, I'm running out of space, but I have one more step. The last step is to solve for x. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to rewrite my equation underneath this, and I'm going to try to squeeze it all in on this page, sorry. I have x minus 6, quantity squared, is equal to 32. I'm going to take the square root of this side and the square root of this side. On the left-hand side, I get x minus 6. On the right-hand side, I'm going to get plus or minus 4 radical 2, because 32 is 16 times 2. Then I'm going to go right here, and I'm going to add 6 to both sides, and I get 6 plus or minus 4 radical 2. And now I have solved the equation for x by factoring using completing the square. So that's all of your new information. I'm going to pull your steps back down. You need to write all these steps down, and then I will do several examples for you, walking through each of these steps on several different problems. All right, so let's do our next example. I'm not going to have the steps handy, but you should have those steps handy so you can understand what I'm going to do. So I'm going to write solve by completing the square. So that's what CTS stands for. It's completing the square. And you're going to be given x squared plus 6x plus 4 is equal to 0. All right. First step was to take the 4 to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared plus 6x is equal to a negative 4. The next step, and I'll write it over here on the side so it's not actually in the way of my math, is I divide the 6 by 2 to get 3, and then I'm going to square the 3, and I get 9. So the next step said to add this value to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to write plus 9 and plus 9. Now on the left-hand side, I have a perfect square trinomial, perfect, perfect, and I can simplify the right. So if I factor the left, I'm going to get x plus 3, quantity squared, is equal to 5. And let's just check. If I do 3 times x, and then I double that, I get 6x, which is the middle term, so I know that I factored correctly. Now I'm going to solve by taking the square root of both sides, and I get x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 5. Subtract 3 from both sides, and I get a negative 3 plus or minus radical 5, and this one is done. Okay, and I'm not going to number the steps, but I will talk you through them. So let's do another example. I have quite a few for you, just so you can kind of get the hang of what we're doing. So I'm going to solve by completing the square. This time my equation is going to be x squared minus 10x plus 8 is equal to 0. All right, so the first step is to take the 8 to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared minus 10x is equal to a -8. And I always leave some space so that I can manage my math all together. Now I'm going to talk about my middle term. So I take the middle term and I divide it by 2 and I get a -5, and then I square it to get a positive 25. Middle term, divide by 2, square it, and now I'm going to add that to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to write plus 25 and plus 25. Noticing that the net effect of that number combination is actually 0, so I haven't changed the equation, I just manipulated it. And now when I solve this, I get x minus 5. You always have to keep the sign of the middle term, is equal to the square root of, is 17. Now I can take the square root of both sides, and I get x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus radical 17. It doesn't reduce because 17 is prime. Then I get x is equal to 5 plus or minus radical 17. And then I'm done. Completing the square is actually a really, really nice method to use. There are times when it becomes more entertaining, which is an example I'm about to show you, but it's still quite useful. All right, here's your next example. Again, it says solve by completing the square. So this time your equation is going to be 3x squared plus 12x minus 18 is equal to 0. And if you'll notice, this one is a little bit different because now my leading coefficient is not 1. So that changes what we do slightly, but the overall process is the same. So first I'm going to take the 18 to the other side. I leave some space, equals a positive 18. Since I have a leading coefficient that's not 1, now what I have to do is factor it out just on the left-hand side. So I'm going to factor out the 3 to get 4x. I'm going to leave some space, and there's my 18. All right? 4 is now my middle term, so I'm going to divide 4 by 2 to get 2, and then I square it to get 4. So I'm going to add 4 to this side, but what I have to manage is this 4 distributed to the 3, so I'm going to add 12 to the other side. This is the only step that's different. Okay? Now I'm going to factor. I keep the 3, it doesn't disappear yet, and I'm going to have x plus 2, quantity squared, is equal to 30. Now I can divide this side by 3 and this side by 3, and I'm going to get x plus 2, quantity squared, is equal to 10. Now I can take the square root of both sides, and I'm going to get x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 10. And then I'll come up here to finish, and I get x is equal to a -2 plus or minus radical 10, and then I'm done. So this one is a little bit different because the leading coefficient was not 1, and the main difference is that I have to multiply the 3 and the 4 together and add 12 to the other side instead of just 4. Otherwise, my problem would not be accurate. All right, I have one more example for you, and then I'll give you your problems. Okay, so here's our last example. I want you to solve by completing the square, and I'm going to give you 2x squared plus 16x plus 12 is equal to 0. Noticing that the leading coefficient again is not 1, so I need to change my process just a little bit. First I'm going to move the 12, and I have 2x squared plus 16x is equal to a negative, 12. I'm going to factor the 2 out, and I get x squared plus 8x, I'm going to leave some space, is a -12. Half of 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is going to be 16. So in here I'm going to add 16, but remember I have to distribute that, and so now I'm going to add 32 because 16 times 2 is 32 to the other side. I'm going to leave the 2, and I'm going to write it as x plus 4 quantity squared is equal to 20. Now I'm going to divide by 2. I get x plus 4, quantity squared is 10. Take the square root of both sides, and I get x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 10. And then my last step, x is equal to a negative 4 plus or minus radical 10, and I'm done. Okay? It's really a very quick and efficient method. All right, so now your learning is over, and I'm going to give you some problems so you can practice your new skills. So here are your problems. All of them say to solve by completing the square, and I would recommend that you have the steps right beside you as you try to work through these problems. The first one is x squared plus 6x minus 3 is equal to 0. Problem number 2, x squared minus 18x plus 86 is equal to 0. Problem 3, 4x squared minus 40x minus 12 is equal to 0. And your last problem for the day, problem number 4, is 7t squared plus 28t plus 56 is equal to 0. The last two problems are very similar to the last two examples that I did. I still recommend that you have the steps handy as you try to work through these problems. Good luck, and I will see you in class tomorrow.